It takes a moment, and a moment many times is what I'm referring to as weeks, months, and years for people to really start to recognize that a behavior is a pacifier.
That was Dustin Morris, my guest this week on the Recover Yourself podcast. Hello, I'm your host, Martin John, the Recovery Mentor. This podcast is all about supporting caregivers of all kinds, especially those in the field of recovery. I'm interested in expanding our ideas of the words addiction and recovery so that we all have the opportunity to recover ourselves. Because it is when we can recover ourselves that we can truly help others and it not tax our system. Actually, after recovering ourselves, we will find that the more we give, the more we're capable of giving. Today, you're in for such a treat because this episode is all about one of my favorite topics, pacifiers. Dustin is a great choice for this episode because of his interest in how lifestyle connects to disease and illness. So if shifting your lifestyle is imperative, you need to know that that kind of shift doesn't happen without the awareness of our pacifiers. You see, pacifiers are things that we use to escape our lives, our feelings, relationships, and just about anything else we might want to escape. These pacifiers can turn into addictions, but they can also spark some serious illness. Now, a pacifier can be anything from food, exercise, reading, or even the act of being frustrated or overly embracing any emotion. Even detaching emotionally can be a pacifier for some. I want to add that, of course, drugs and alcohol, they can start as pacifiers as well. And these are so sneaky because in our lives, they can often feel like water to a fish. You'll see in this episode that we might start out engaging with pacifiers simply because we enjoy them. Then, at some point, we may find ourselves using them to escape. Things like this can wax and wane throughout our lives and may never become a serious problem. And I want to add that this episode is not trying to get you to stop engaging in your pacifiers. Actually, we just want you to become aware of them and when you're engaging them to escape. Because if we can add the slightest bit of awareness to them, their power over us and our desire to escape will both disintegrate. Dustin, thank you so much for joining me. I'm really appreciative of you taking the time to talk with me about pacifiers.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, so pacifiers is a thing and I don't know if people use this term too often, but in my work, I've coined this kind of phrase, pacifiers, but it makes sense to call all of the things that we do to kind of check out pacifiers. Can you talk to me a bit about your relationship with these as it relates to your research in addiction and other things like that?
Yeah, so, I really like the term. I don't know, outside of, us first discussing this, I really don't know that I had seen a lot of people refer to it as a pacifier. But, when you think about what is a pacifier for, it's basically to soothe a feeling, right, or an emotion that we're having. And so I think one of the things that we've looked at, matter of fact, one of your guests previous to me, Dr. Stephanie Rose, her and I have looked at a couple of things. Yeah, she's my colleague, and her and I have looked at a couple of things in exercise and substance abuse, seeing if people are actually switching from one addiction to another. So really not addressing some of the really problem behaviors, but simply go from being addicted to substance abuse to moving into something that's, typically in our society, it's more accepted, but being addicted to exercise, where it too can become a problem and it too becomes a pacifier. So from that perspective, that's some of the work that we've been doing, looking at, is there an issue with moving people out of, drug and alcohol addiction, but by giving them some other behavior in which they can use, that behavior too becomes a pacifier. So really, Martin, it gets down to being aware of whether or not we're using a behavior to pacify another. And at what degree do we do that? So I think that's really important. And that's some of the stuff that we've been looking at with exercise as it relates to substance abuse and addiction.
And I think exercise is a great place to start with that. But I look at it as so many things, and really it's a mindset, right? Because if you're utilizing something to escape an experience or escape a feeling, and even if it's habit, even if it's a habit, like if you sit down every night and read for 4 hours, right? Like that could be being used as a pacifier. How have you seen with your work in exercise any markers where people can like this, I might be doing this as a pacifier?
Yeah. I think it's kind of one of those things that when I think about it as a scholar, and then also with a long history in exercise as a trainer and as a health coach, it takes it takes a moment, and a moment many times is what I'm referring to is weeks, months, and years for people to really start to recognize that a behavior is a pacifier, right? So let me give you an example. And many years ago, when I was involved in a lot of endurance competitions, running long distance and triathlons and this sort of thing, and I started coaching that, I slowly started to recognize that not only my clients, but through my clients, I also learned that I too, many times had used running and swimming and cycling as a way to pacify uh, different emotional issues that I might have been having in other aspects of my life, right? Now, I think what's important about that, Martin, is that number one, how do we begin to recognize that that's what we're using it for, right? Because there's a variety of different things. Like, for example, you said, let's take the example of looking at reading, right? Well, somebody might be reading for the sake of enjoyment. They just truly like to read. That can move from being something that you're doing in a leisure capacity for the sake of just enjoying to actually being put in place as a way to cope with some other unhealthy issue that's going on in your life, whether it's occupational, relational, and those things are tied in emotionally. The key there, in my opinion, is to recognize when it goes from one to the other, meaning when does it move from being leisurely to becoming a coping mechanism in a way that might not necessarily benefit you in the long run. Because although reading can be beneficial, if reading becomes this way that you pacify another unhealthy behavior, then that too can be problematic. And I saw this a lot of times in exercise. So what I would see is I would see people that really maybe were having relational issues. And instead of addressing the relational issue, they would use the exercise in order to basically cope and compensate for their unwillingness, or at the time their inability to know actually how to address the problem behavior, right? And that's not really helping. Although the exercise is great, right, or although the reading is great, it's really not helping the person address the real issue at hand. So they're still in a way kind of dysfunctionally coping with the behavior that's problematic because they're really not dealing with the behavior, right? It's becoming the exercise or the reading is becoming a pacifier. It's basically a way to soothe the problem behavior that we don't want to address or try to figure out why it's going on in our lives.
Oh man, what a great way of expressing that. That's exactly how I like talking about these things. I just released an episode, and this will release in a couple of weeks, but I just released an episode where I spoke about long game versus short game. And I even talked about like marriage. A marriage is short game because the
Right.
marriage can end and things can grow, but the long game within marriage is understanding how we love each other and how we want what's best for each other, right? Like that's why we got married. It's not we didn't get married so we can stay married. We
Right.
got married so we can have this deep relationship. And we
Right.
are exercising so we can have this healthier sort of response or healthier relationship to our surroundings and our body, not because we work out 6 days a week, not because I once ran into someone whose sister-in-law was like an ultra marathoner. My first question was she an addict? And he was like, "Yep." And I was like, "Who else would do that?" Not that, not that like all like ultra marathoners are addicts, but there is something to that where when you get to a certain point, we do have to question, like, is this avoiding something?
Right.
What is the light like that some people need to go on for them to realize it? Because you're not going to realize it at first because you're like, no, this is good for me. Like I'm reading because I enjoy it. And that story continues even though maybe you're not even recognizing that it's not that you don't enjoy it, but that you're not currently enjoying it.
Right. Yeah, and that's kind of a tough one for me because I even with the years that I've been doing this, for the longest time I've tried to figure out is there a methodology, a process that you can give to somebody and say, okay, hey, step one, right? Step two, step three, step four. And even through my own discovery, working with my own clients and coaching and through their discovery and watching them as they evolve and change, it's fluid, right? And there is not a step one and then a step two and then a step three and a step four. And I think there's maturation that goes on in the process. And, you have to really push through it to get to it type of thing. You've got to experience it to know where you need to be. It's really hard to know where you need to be without going through the process, right? And so a lot of this, I think, really comes down to awareness, right? You have to have the time and the space to really understand the why and the what we're doing. I think that's really, really important, and that really, it sounds easier to do than it is. And I think that's really why it's difficult to tell people this is the process, but being fully aware and willing to accept your thoughts and your actions really kind of puts you at the top of that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Self-actualization is the understanding of why we're doing what we're doing. What are the precipitative behaviors that occur or the thoughts that occur that make us want to engage in a behavior or not. So I think you can simplify that to a certain degree. And when you're sitting down and you let's say you sit down to read for the night, right? Or you lace up your shoes to go on a run for the afternoon. I think it's always good to have the cognitive space and time to quickly reflect on why is it that I'm doing this? Mm-hmm. Literally ask yourself the question, right? Why am I reading tonight? And you might find and discover in that process that you just take joy and pleasure in the reading in and of itself, right? But as you continue to do that, you might start to find out that you're also reading for other reasons, right? Or it's the same thing with exercise, right? That you're exercising for other reasons. There's an old adage with runners that many of them say, well, the reason I run so much is because I'm metaphorically trying to run away from other problems in my life, right? Yeah. But it takes a period of time to discover that. And I think the only way that we do that is through reflection. So every time you get ready to do an activity, you might ask yourself, why is it that you're doing that? And that's cognitive space. That's the time to move out of the habituation of the behavior. So you're just doing it to do it and really ask yourself, well, why is it that you do this? A great example maybe of that is many years ago, I was out training with a client and he was preparing for a marathon and we were out running and, it's all conversation at first. Everybody's excited and you're 2 or 3 miles in and everybody's feeling fresh. And we got to about mile 15 and it becomes a struggle physically, mentally, and sometimes even emotionally for people. And it became very quiet. And this particular client looked over at me and said, do you really enjoy this? Right? And so I stopped in that process. We actually came to a complete stop. And I said, I want you to reflect on why you were out here today. You're asking me the question, but ultimately you're trying to answer this for yourself. Why are you out here? Do you really enjoy this? Are you enjoying the environment, or are you doing this for another reason? Right? And I think, Martin, I really think that's the first step, right? In recovery is understanding the reasons for why we're doing something, right? Whether it's engaging in an addictive behavior because we're drinking or we're using some other form of drug, or we're using a different type of behavior to pacify a problem behavior. And are we really addressing the issue? So, ultimately, if you're reading because you're getting enjoyment out of it and you're getting into the book and you find that gives you some peace of mind, some comfort, some quality of life, then I think we're using it for the right reasons. But if we begin to use it to pacify a problem behavior and we're not fixing or trying to create solutions for the problem behavior, then the behavior that we think that we're doing for a beneficial reason is really not contributing to the growth of ourselves, right? We're simply using it just to try to cover up or cope with a behavior that we're not willing to really address.
And that can be real wide. Like someone might read just to get their mind to stop criticizing them. Someone might read so that they can go to the office and tell people that they've read 12 books this month. Someone might, it's all sorts of things. And everybody is going to use these pacifiers for different reasons, and they're going to have to define them for themselves. When I do my workshops, I often I always ask, how many people chose to drink coffee today? And everyone raises their hand. And then I say, okay, how many of you actually chose to drink coffee today versus just executed a decision you made a long time ago? And then everyone realizes that they didn't make a choice to drink coffee today. Maybe a couple over the years that I've been doing this have, but most people are just executing what they did yesterday.
That's the thing about behavior, right? That's the thing about behavior is that when we incorporate a behavior on a very frequent kind of scale, frequent process, it does become habitual. We stop thinking about it. We stop thinking about why we're doing it, but we just do it, right? And I think that's one of the things that, if you sit down and you have a greater level of awareness as to why you're engaging in a specific behavior, many times you'll have a better outcome and a more desirable outcome. For example, you mentioned coffee. There are many times that I get up in the morning and I just have a cup of coffee. And I have a cup of coffee because it's like putting on my socks, right? But today, this afternoon, before we decided to have a conversation, I thought, I think I'd like to have a cup of coffee. And here's what makes that different. I actually thought about the taste of the coffee, and I thought, I really would like to savor the flavor of a nice warm cup of coffee before we start the conversation. That's a different level of awareness, right? So I'm no longer just habitually taking the drink of the coffee, but I'm really engaging in it for a very specific purpose, right? And I think ultimately, when you think about behavior change, that's the first step in the behavior change process, right? Because in order to change your behavior, you have to be aware of why you're engaging in the behavior to begin with, right? Mm-hmm. And so when we start to think about changes as it relates to addiction or abstinence, in order to get to that point, we have to be able to ask ourselves, why are we doing it to begin with, right? And that brings us kind of full circle back to, well, being aware. And I think that's a really good point that you bring up about coffee, because I think there's a lot of different behaviors that we engage in. We really don't know why we're doing it. But if we dig into it a little bit, if we slow ourselves down, usually we can start to discover, well, what's the reason? What's the purpose behind this given behavior at this given time?
And you mentioned earlier this idea of like being aware sounds so much easier than it will be.
Yeah.
But I believe that it sounds easier than it will be at first. And then once you get accustomed to it, it's actually a lot less laborious than it ever even sounded.
Right. Yeah. When I work with my clients, one of the things that I try to have them do is I try to have them envision themselves like on the big screen, right? So almost watching themselves make the decision as to why they're not going to engage in a behavior. So it's this mental rehearsal that I try to have clients do. So it's like, being able to start that process of mental rehearsal. Again, it's having enough time to slow yourself down to say, okay, I need to stop and ask myself, why am I about ready to buy this candy bar, right? And so you have to process that. And you're doing this, Martin, all the while you're standing in line to check out.
Yeah.
So it's milliseconds. Many times it's milliseconds or seconds. And so you're standing in the line and, the urge says, I'd like to taste some sweet chocolate candy bar, or whatever your favorite, treat is. And then you have to mentally process, well, why do I want that right now? Well, what are the benefits if I do, and what are the drawbacks if I don't, right? And so you walk through this little process with yourself, and regardless of whether you make this decision to buy and eat the candy bar or not, I think you're in a better position because you've been aware as to why you've made the choice, right? And I think once it becomes easier to make the choice, then what actually happens is it also becomes easier to choose differently.
Yes.
But that level of awareness has to be there, right? Because you can easily say, you know what? I've processed all of the reasons that I thought I wanted this particular thing, whether it be a candy bar, a drug, coffee, exercise, and I've made the conclusion based on my cognitive analysis that today is not a good day for me to do this, right? Or it could be the flip of that. I've made the cognitive processing based on this, and today is a good day for me to do this. But that level of awareness allows you to freely either choose or freely extinguish that behavior. Because when it becomes habitual, there's no thought process that really goes into it. right?
No.
And that becomes a real that can become a real danger or a real struggle as to trying to figure out how to extinguish or even adopt new behaviors. That awareness is the first process, and one of the models that we use is called the trans-theoretical model. It's a stage change behavior model, and one of the things that we talk about is moving people from pre-contemplation to contemplation. So that, stage one is pre-contemplation. It's not even thinking about what you're doing, right? In order to get to behavior change, you got to at least start thinking about it before you can ever begin to change it. And that's what we're kind of addressing here. It's that level of cognition and that level of awareness that gets you to that next step, which eventually allows you to either adopt or extinguish a behavior.
And when we're dealing with pacifiers, we have to recognize. So we're talking pretty far down the line, right? Like both of you and I have experienced this, and we've been working on this for quite some time. A lot of people that are listening to this maybe are just starting to realize that they're not making the choices that they're making in their life. And I just want to interject that if you have a pacifier, you have probably been engaging in that pacifier a lot longer than you believe you have. And so engaging in it again today, not such a big deal.
Right.
So if you ask yourself, interesting, I don't want to turn on Netflix, but I feel uncomfortable. Okay, turn it on. No one's asking you to stop like cold turkey like that. Like no one's asking you, no one's telling you, and it's not bad. And I don't care if your drug of choice is heroin. If you've been utilizing heroin as a pacifier and you continue to use it today, even while you're listening to this, like, that's okay. Because you have to figure this out. You have to be able to question, why am I doing it now? Because every time you do it is not the same. Every time you do it is unique, and you have the opportunity to just question that.
Correct. And I think that's one of the things that, when we're struggling with the behavior change process, is that giving yourself a lot of credit for awareness is a really big step in the process. That's as much, or that's as important as actually the change itself, right? Because there is no change without awareness.
That's right.
So many times what you have to do is you repeatedly have to have awareness before you can have change. And so to your example, right, there will be a number of times that you think, I don't think I'm going to watch that, and I'm going to try to do something else, but you feel uncomfortable, and so you go back to that old behavior because that's what you're aware of. Or that's what's not you're aware of. That's what you're used to, right? It's habitual. You recognize it. But where you pat yourself on the back is that might be the first day that you actually were aware of why you were doing it.
Yeah.
Right. And that's good. That's a great step in recovery. And so day two might come along and you might do the same thing again. You might say, I think I'm going to try something different. And then all of a sudden you feel uncomfortable and you go right back to Netflix. Right. But again, you've made, okay, hey, 2 days in a row, I've been aware, right? And so you have to basically put a notch on your belt as a victory, because that too is a victory, right? It's being able to make that level of awareness. And over time, that can actually start to create that behavior change process. And I think where I've seen people fail in the process is they become very discouraged because they think that change should happen just like that, right? Mm-hmm. Behavior change doesn't happen that way. It's a very slow process. And so we have to give ourselves the opportunity and be forgiving of ourselves when we don't have full change, but we're aware of why change needs to occur. And that's a really important process.
I tell people all the time, you can go to a Tony Robbins event and walk on fire, and that's all fine and good, but in a month, you're going to be right back where you started just because you don't, over a weekend or 10 days or whatever, change your entire life. Actually, your life is changed through the tiniest of shifts. And that's, and anytime, and that's what I want my podcast to be able to do. And that's what I want my work to do, is just to get people to just make the tiniest shift into awareness, because that is going to change your life. And you don't need me for that. You do that. Like, that's your work.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of those things to where when you start to think about life in general, it's a journey, and it is a combination of a multitude of choices and behaviors that we engage in through our life. And, looking at ideally, being able to look back and have some wisdom as to why did I choose this? Why did I move in this direction? What caused me to want to do this? What caused me to want to do that? At the end of the day, that's awareness, and it is being able to identify behaviors that help us progress and move forward, and the behaviors that pacify us and that kind of keep us stuck in the same place, right? And so those are the kind of things that when you think about moving forward in behavior, if we're doing things to pacify progression, then we need to remove that. And we need to look to see why we're engaging in those behaviors. And I think it's a really important point to consider as you start to try to create a pathway for yourself that allows you to be a healthier and live a better quality of life.
We live in we're in the United States. We live in a space right now where we are really touting live a better life. And that is being touted through products, services, and all sorts of things. Which I believe most of those, I don't want to say all because I don't know all of the products and things, but most of those are leading us to pacify so that we can be like, hey, you're going to live a better life if you engage in this thing. So now I'm engaging in something that's telling me I can live a better life, and I am once again the victim of things outside of myself, even if it is, making me like feel better for the short term or whatnot. Can you speak a little bit about the nation of dopamine addicts that we have?
Oh my gosh, right. Everything's about feeling good.
Right.
It's all about feeling good. And I think we talked earlier about, we had an earlier conversation between ourselves. It was like, what are the difference between a few of these things? And I jotted that down. And so we can start there. What does it mean to feel good? Well, a lot of times when we look at what that means for us, it's where we're describing this immediate kind of emotional response to a favorable outcome. It's something that we want, and it produces something that we desire. And so that makes us feel good. So for example, maybe you just found out that you're given a promotion at work, or that you receive a pay raise. And so feeling good is always typically associated with some sort of positive or favorable situation or outcome that creates this positive or emotional spike, right? But the problem with that is that once that spike's over, it goes back down. And then we're looking for that next spike, and that next spike, and that next spike, and that next spike. And it's just this exhaustible type of process that it's unattainable, right? It's something that you can't continue to have. You can't continue to buy and consume and buy and consume and buy and consume.
Hungry ghosts, as they say, right?
Yeah, exactly. So at what point in time do you become content, and what is that based upon? And so I think we kind of address this idea of, well, what's fulfillment, And so, fulfillment doesn't really rely on these fleeting positive outcomes or kind of feeling good, right? It's not based on a promotion or the house that you buy or the money that you have in the bank or even relationships. I think you kind of alluded to this earlier with marriage. It's more concrete than that. Because happiness a lot of times is very fleeting, right? Because it's there and then it's not. That's there and then it's not. Fulfillment to a large extent is going to be based more on awareness, right? It's recognizing who you are, where you are in your process at your very moment, and you're okay with that, right? In this moment right now, are you okay with where you're at? Are you engaged in the process, right? And you do that while you realize you can change it if you choose to change it. That's all within your ability. So it's being able to recognize and embrace every moment, realizing that every moment's dynamic, and that you're going to move through your thoughts and actions and be aware of what you're doing. And if we're not doing that, and we're basing everything on whether or not you feel happy, happy is a fleeting moment. Happiness is a fleeting moment, and it's going to be, you can have it in 10 minutes, and then you can go about your day and say, well, I don't feel very happy right now, so I need to go do something that will boost that mood. And what you're talking about from our society is that's what we sell now, right? We sell, you need a bigger phone, you need a fancier car, you need more money in the bank, you need a bigger home. And when we aspire to those things and we're not looking at fulfillment, I really think we set ourselves up to want to pacify. I mean, when you think about it, it's like you don't like your job because you're not making enough money, or you're not living in a big enough house. So then what do you do on the weekend? Well, you go home and you buy a big 40 and you smoke a bunch of weed because you're so depressed about the things that you don't have. You just have to remove yourself from all of those thoughts. So you pacify yourself like crazy,
Yeah.
right? There becomes the vicious cycle because you're not content with just being who you are in the moment, in the process, right? Being able to have a conversation with somebody or engage in something that you're reading or watch a movie and be involved in that at a level of depth that you're not really trying to feel better about who you are, but you're just absorbed in the moment. And I think that's a real challenge for us at this day and age.
And I think it's interesting because we look at, all right, so you don't think you have a big enough house or a nice enough car or all of these sorts of things, that we traditionally look at, consumerist sort of markers. And I'm just kind of riffing here on this idea that, like, well, that desire to have those things is in and of itself a pacifier for you, maybe not feeling worthy, maybe not feeling like there's enough, maybe feeling lack or whatever. Like, you don't want to face this thing, and so all of a sudden you're a victim to it.
Absolutely. I mean, sometimes, I don't know if you've ever had this feeling, but you can get on. I myself have had this feeling where you can get on Facebook or you can get on Instagram, and you see your friends and your family and all these acquaintances, and everything is going great in their life, and they all look so beautiful, and they've got all these things, and you start to say, well, what's wrong with me? Why don't I have these things? What's going on in my life? And I think, again, that contributes to this desire to try to operate and exist at a level that it's not realistic, right? It's very unrealistic. We always, in social media, we always portray our best sides. And that's only a small part of who we are. And it doesn't mean that the other side of us is a bad side. It's just more of I would say, the kind of the more realistic or the more normal side. It's the day-to-day of life that we go through. And I think when we're trying to ascertain these very unattainable markers, it really sets us up to feel discouraged. It sets us up to feel unhappy, unfulfilled. And then I think we do start going to look for ways to pacify that. And it can be very unhealthy because we're not content in who we are and we're not aware of what we are. And I think that's really, it's a real challenge for all of us. I don't think it's just people who, might be going through a heroin addiction. I think this is a bigger issue for all of us because I know in the classwork that I do, I have a lot of young, healthy individuals who still are looking for something to identify their purpose. And it's like, why are we wanting other things to identify our purpose, right? Why am I looking for that? Why do I look at a celebrity's web page or their Instagram page or their Twitter page and try to identify through them and have them tell me what my purpose is, right? I think it's a real struggle, and it does set us up for a lot of the unhealthy behaviors and the unhealthy outcomes that we're seeing in our society right now. There's so much anger and frustration, and when those emotions and those feelings kind of rule the day, we're going to do the best that we can to try to tame those, pacify those in whatever way that we can. And so it is a very big struggle. And I think that's across the board for any person, regardless of whether we're dealing with, a traditional addiction or not, right? I think it's just really something that most of us have to be aware of and try to find out how to work through that in our own journey.
Yeah, I think stigma has really kind of kept people from seeing that, oh, I might have addiction issues as well, even though they're not associated with what we traditionally see as, problematic addictions or whatnot, and that's what the recover to kind of conversation is all about, because we all have something to recover to. There's never a point where you're not recovering to something. okay, we can say we're not recovering from at the moment, and that's great. Like you might have to recover from the death of a family member. You might have to recover from a diagnosis, all sorts of things to recover from. And that just means your mind is being kind of guided by some thing that you need to get over. But recovering too is like, once your mind is yours again,
Right.
how are you going to be aware of it?
No, and I was going to say, and that's when you say once your mind is yours again. And the other thing that came to my mind right there, Martin, was, and how do you keep it? Right? How do you keep it? How do you not fall back into that same pattern? Right? Because, when you were talking about, people and addiction as it relates to other things besides drugs and alcohol, I mean, I watch people who struggle to ascertain certain markers in work, because if they don't ascertain that marker, then somehow they're not successful, or they're not, or they don't consider themselves to be worthy, or they don't see their purpose in it. In scholarship for us, as many times as faculty members, the markers placed on how many publications do you have, right, how many grants have you written, and if you haven't done a certain amount, well, you're not as good as the next scholar that played the game, right? And that can be very troubling and very unhealthy for people, because then they're comparing themselves maybe to unrealistic marks. And so then that becomes an addiction, right? That becomes their addiction. It's like, okay, I'm up at all hours of the night trying to produce another publication, because I've got to hit that mark up there. Because if I don't hit that mark, that arbitrary mark, then I don't decide, then I'm making the decision for myself, well, then I'm not successful. And thus I'm not happy.
Right.
And who says that has to be the mark for each individual? I think we have to find where we are in our own purpose and what that looks like. And that's really important.
And being part of a group is another episode that I did a while back. And,
yes.
and being part of a group could be, a pacifier in and of itself. It's like, I now associate with something that has strict rules, guidelines, and regulations for me to understand and not be uncomfortable with living my life, right? I'm not uncomfortable because I know what it takes to be successful.
Right. Yeah, and that's, you're exactly right. That does happen. And I think, the thing is being able to kind of identify or define your own success. What does that look like for who you are as an individual? And in this day and age, in our society, it's very challenging, because we do have these markers that are set, whether they're realistic or unrealistic, and we try to.
But they're all arbitrary, whether they're realistic or not.
They are. A great example of this, I mean, I can tell you, I'd be at the gym when I was training people before I became a scholar and a faculty member. And I would have people come in and they would say, hey, Coach D, I want to lose weight and get shape. I'd be like, okay, great. What's one of your goals? I want to be 6% body fat. And I would be like, where are you coming up with this number? Like, what's the difference between 6% and like 8% or 10% or 15%, right? And so they would set these goals many times, and it was many times either unachievable, or if they didn't hit that arbitrary goal, then somehow they would see that as a failure. And even though they had success, even though maybe they had lost 35 pounds or 40 pounds and they were doing things in their life that they had never done before, because they didn't hit that one specific mark, well, that was it. It was all over. Yeah. And so trying to teach people, it's not necessarily always about the end game as much as it is about the journey. Because that journey allows us to see why we're making the choices that we're making, why we're behaving in the way that we're behaving, and does the behavior line up with the goal and kind of the vision that you've put out for yourself? And the question becomes, why have you created that vision? Is it your vision and your vision alone? Is that what you want for who you are? Or is it some arbitrary vision that you've kind of developed through viewing other people and seeing what other people think that you should be doing? And I think that's a real struggle. I see this a lot in our work when we deal with youth, Martin, as it relates to vaping use, e-cig use, drug and alcohol use. So many times that behavior is tied not to what they want or desire for themselves, but it's tied to group, like you mentioned earlier, right? So it's the group that's driving that behavior. And so many times we'll reflect with them and say, hey, write down on a piece of paper why you're doing these things, right? And so that's that first step of awareness. Well, I do it because the group does it. And so then we can get into conversations. So do you want to be like everybody in the group? Well, not necessarily. Okay, so then why are you engaging in that? And many times there's these scratch your head moments, and it takes a lot of time. And somebody say, I really don't know why I'm engaging in that. And I'm like, well, that's great. That's the first step, right? Yeah. That's the very first step. It's like discovering that you don't know is knowing something, right?
Right.
I think that's a really big process when we move through it. So many times in recovery, we don't give ourselves enough credit for, as you mentioned, the very small things that we do, because those small things in the long run are very monumental, and they help you achieve a lot.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned that idea that like, oh, I don't know why I'm engaging in this. When I talk to adults about things like that, they don't know, but they will defend themselves and their use of it anyway. Like you like the taste of tobacco. My guess is the first time you had tobacco, you didn't. Nobody. No, I don't know anybody that had a cigarette and said, "Man, that tastes so good."
Right, right.
Like, that's delicious. But ultimately they had another, and that was the thing. Like when they made the choice to have another, they made it probably because of the group. So, but you'll still defend it.
Yeah, you do. And I asked a very similar question in my classes. I say, by the show of hands, how many people think that a young person in high school stands up one day in a classroom or a group of people and says, hey, I want to grow up and be a crack addict? Or who stands up and says, hey, I want to grow up and be a heroin addict? Or, hey, I want to grow up and be morbidly obese. Nobody does that, right? That's not what anybody desires for their life. And so then we have to start to explore, well, then why does that occur? Right. What is the catalyst that begins that process? And I think you're on to the actual answers there when you talk about, well, there's a lot of group structure that goes into that, right? So for so many times, for those of us that we start it because we're encouraged through peers, not necessarily because it's somebody's trying to get us to do something unhealthy, but many times it's to be a part of a process, to be a part of a group, right? And then that one thing can lead to the next. And so again, being able to step back, and I know I keep talking about this a lot, but
it's the only step there is.
And being able to step back and say, okay, why am I really doing this?
Right.
Do I really feel like I want to? Is it something I should? How is it going to make me feel if I do it? What will be the outcome if I don't? What will be the outcome if I do? There's so much self-talk that has to go into it. And then once we move past a certain point, self-talk becomes very minimized and habituation of behavior takes over.
Yeah.
Right? And so that self-talk is the awareness. And so eventually you have to really fight like crazy to get self-talk back, to get awareness back, right? And so how might that happen? Well, certainly you can have accountability through a significant other or a friend that's going through that same process to work through it with you. Say, hey man, I wanted to call you up and talk to you about something today. I've been feeling like doing X. Okay, well, you become their internal voice, but for a while you're their internal external voice, right? You're their little voice sitting on their shoulder saying, well, why do you feel like that today? Well, because blah, blah, well, what do you think the outcome would be? So you're really working with that person to get them back into that mental rehearsal of, why am I about to engage in the things that I'm going to engage in? And where is that coming from? And I think that's such a big process, regardless of whether it's for addiction or engaging in any kind of behavior, is being aware and understanding why is probably the most important thing that we can do as it relates to change.
And that will create change.
And you can fade in and out of awareness, but you're right. Yeah. Once you start that process, if you're consistent with it, it too takes on a mind of its own. It becomes a habit. You'll get to a point where you will really try to have some cognitive space tied into everything you do, and you make the decision, okay, why do I want to do that now? And how does that fit into the rest of the things that I'm going to do for today? And what's that gonna feel like? And is that the right thing for me to be doing? And I know as you and I talk about this, it sounds like it's a really big ordeal, like it takes a lot of time. And it does take time, but it's all internalized. So it's something that you're doing internally. And like I said, it can all happen in 30 seconds from the time that you step into the checkout line to the time that you actually get to the cashier, right? In that period of time, you can make the decision as to whether or not you're buying the candy bar.
Like I recognize myself saying, I don't want this within seconds. And
Yes.
within like 2 seconds, I pick something up and I'm like, wait, I don't really want this. And I can put it down or not.
Right.
But either way, it's like language. When you were learning a language, you had to search for words. Like if you're learning a second language, you have to search for words. You have to kind of think about it. You have to phrase things properly. But once you go back to your language of choice, your first language, you're smooth and you can have conversations. You can talk in idioms. You can do all sorts of stuff, and you don't even think about it.
Right, yeah. And I think that's really important to remember, is that when you go through this process, there's a certain amount of practice that's required. And so it's like anything else. You have to, if you listen to the podcast and you say, okay, well, what I want to try this, what's my next step? The very next step is just to think about every action. And when I work with a client, I tell them, let's begin with something easy, like, why do you put on your socks? And people will laugh at me and say, well, what do you mean? Why do I put them in? Well, answer the question. As you're engaging in that, why are you putting on socks? And I'm not looking for a right answer. I'm looking at your ability to increase your awareness of why you put a sock on your foot, right? And so there's a lot of answers that go into that. Maybe your feet are cold. Maybe your feet sweat. Maybe you get blisters on your feet because you wear a pair of shoes. Well, maybe you'll choose to wear a different pair of shoes. Maybe you'll choose not to wear socks because it's hot outside. But the point is it's not necessarily that I'm looking for a given answer or a specific answer. It's that I'm asking you to be more aware of the choice that you're about ready to make.
Right.
And that's the most important thing, right? Because being aware of why you are going to make the choice typically will eventually lead to you making a better choice. Though I always tell my students when we're learning about human behavior, one of the most important reasons, questions to ask rather, is why do we do something, right? Trying to figure that out. And that lends itself to awareness, which is probably one of the most important things we can look at.
And pacifiers just take us away from questioning that.
It really does. It really does. It doesn't matter what kind of pacifier we're engaged in. If we're just pacifying, we are not thinking, right?
That's right.
And so that's, every time you get up and grab that cup of coffee of the morning, and I'm not downplaying coffee. I mean, if you want a cup of coffee, that's great. But again, do you really want it? And I think, what this is a really good lesson, Martin, is I think it teaches us that we can be fulfilled in life with a lot less, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of things that we don't need in life to feel really fulfilled, right? And so I think that can really, and I've noticed that in my own growth, in my own journey, is the more aware I become, the less of things I need in order to feel comfortable and happy in my own life, because I feel, the word I use is content. I feel content. I wake up and my day is pleasant and I go about it for the most part in peace. I'm happy in that place. And every once in a while, like everybody else, I start to struggle. Well, why don't I have, or what I should have, and I have to go back to that process again, right? And I have to start to think, well, why am I thinking that? Right? Is that really going to help me have a better life? Or am I really going to get a whole lot out of it? And when I can process through that, usually the answer is, I'm okay without it. Right? And so I think that's kind of a really neat place to be. But it's always, there is no master of that, at least in my opinion. I think we're constantly in that battle. And we do that until we leave the earth. I think the most important thing is that we're willing to take that up and have that as part of our journey as we go through, and just try to remember that being able to be aware of why we're doing what we're doing is a really good step in our, in progression in our growth of who we are as people.
Oh, Dustin, thank you so much. This was wonderful. What a great conversation, man.
Yeah, my pleasure. I thank you for having me.
Absolutely. We have found ourselves in a world with more products than ever. I mean, this podcast is a product and you don't need it. I mean, your life doesn't depend on it. We all find ourselves in a world that is full of people who are looking to escape and are willing to use anything to do that. So a perfect storm is brewing between the makers of pacifiers and the people who love them. At the end there, Dustin mentioned how we can do with a lot less, and he is definitely right. But if we're going to do that, we're going to have to really step up on this self-awareness front. And that doesn't mean anything more than just asking the question, well, why am I doing this? I hope you enjoyed this episode, and please check out the description of this episode to find out more about Dustin and his work. Please rate and review this podcast and or leave comments for this episode to help me better create helpful content. Support this show at anchor.fm or support me and my work at Patreon, where you will get access to unedited content as well as writings and access to supporter group portrait sessions with me. I host workshops regularly, which are both open to the public and are a source of continuing education units for professionals. I also take a limited number of one-on-one clients every month, so contact me through martinjohn.com when you are ready to work together. I also accept financial support through Venmo at martinjohn_Garcia, so if you benefit from listening to this content, please consider supporting my efforts. Thank you for listening to the Recover Yourself podcast, and until next time, keep recovering yourself.